Welcome to the International Money Cafe podcast, the show where we filter out the noise on cross-border taxes, finances, and life in the US. I'm your host, Jane Mepham, CFP.
I'm your host, Manasa Nadig, PA. Join us on this journey as we explore these unique challenges facing US inbound-outbound families and businesses. On to the show.
We have a very special episode today. There are thousands and thousands of workers who come to the US on different work visas every year. And we know this because Manasa and I were part of this group. These workers come to the US to make a living, save for their futures, and educate their kids. So essentially give themselves a shot at pursuing the American dream.
Exactly. And these are our favorite people to work with. Foreign-born nationals here in the US on work visas. Right, Jane?
I know, 100% agree with you. And the thing we find is obviously, and this applies to everybody, the working years are the best years to save for the future using the provisions in the US tax code. So glad we have Manasa here because when it comes to taxes, she's my favorite person. The problem is, when you're on work visas, which by nature are temporary, it becomes challenging when it comes to investing. Today, we're going to talk about the challenges employees on non-immigrant work visas face investing in the U.S. via the U.S. special tax code provisions, and there are very many of them. And then we'll also talk about possible solutions. Basically, we want to address in challenges that you find investing in what we call special accounts like 401k, Roth IRAs type of thing.
Yeah, I love this topic. Yeah, let's start out. Let's just briefly talk about different work visas, and then we can dive into it a little more as we go along. We are definitely going to be focusing on non-immigrant employment work visas today. Most of these are in the STEM space, and we are going to skip over the G4. If you're not aware, dear listener, a G4 visa is for employees of international organizations, and they don't pay taxes, but they are considered as a resident for capital gains tax and are taxed at 30%. But that's a brief about G4. We won't go into detail on that. I would like to start with the L1 visa. The L1 visa is a visa given to multinational business executives and specialized workers. These L1 visas are employees of multinational organizations which have a footprint in the country where the employee is currently at, as well as the United States. The duration of this visa is about 5 to 7 years. And they can be given to citizens of any country. And there could be a dual intentionality, and we can go into that a little more later. There is no cap on the number of L1 visas that can be given out. And there are some consequences if the person on the L1 visa loses his job. They would have to leave the country in 60 days or less, or find another job on an L1 or an H1B visa, or switch to some other non-immigrant visa. Did I cover everything, Jane?
I think you did, and that's a great summary of the L1 visa. So I'm just going to dive into one of my favorite visas because this is a visa that I think a lot of people are familiar with. This is the H1B visa, okay? The H-1B visa, basically you have to have a professional job offer. And part of the requirements is the company has to be willing to pay the prevailing or higher wage. You have to have a bachelor's degree or it can be higher. And in terms of duration, it's normally 3 to 6 years. You may be able to get yearly extensions if applying for a green card, which is based on status, which I think we'll talk a little bit later about. And in terms of countries, it can be from any country, but there's one very special type of H-1B visa called H-1B1 visa, which is reserved for workers from Singapore and Chile. It behaves like a normal H-1B visa with a few differences that, again, we can address at some point. You talked about the dual intentionality of the L1 visa. So the H-1B is also a dual intentional visa. The H-1B1 is not. What this basically means is even though these visas are temporary visas, you can apply for a green card and kind of go against the temporary nature of the visa. Hence the dual intentionality, like tending to stay here if I'm able to get the green card is really what it comes down to. And in terms of caps, I think everybody is aware or has heard about the 85,000 visas that are given out every year. But this actually includes what's called cap exempt employees. So if you're hired, let's say, by the university or some non-profit organization, then you don't go into the 85,000 number. And by the way, I think it's 15,000 of these are reserved for people with master's degrees. And kind of following the thing that you used, I'll talk about the consequences of a job loss, because again, these are temporary visas. If you lose your job when you're on the H-1B visa, you have to leave the country in 60 days or less. You have to find another job on an H-1B visa, or you have to switch to another non-immigrant visa. I think I've covered everything on the visa. I'll pass it back to you, Manasa.
Cool, Jane. Let's jump on to the O1 visa next. And I always try to remember the O1 visa as the extraordinary ability visa. That's how an O1 visa criteria is given out. The duration of the visa is for about 3+ years, and it can be given to any person from any country. And the dual intentionality that Jane was talking about earlier, there is a possibility of that on the O1 visa, but it does come with certain restrictions. There is, again, no cap on the O1 visas. And the consequences of job loss on this one, again, is they have to leave the country in 60 days or less, or find another job under the same visa or an H-1B's visa, or again, switch to another immigrant working visa. Did I cover all of that correctly? Or is there something with the switching to another non-immigrant visa, right?
It is correct. And actually, the thing I was going to say is you called it the extraordinary visa. At some point, this was actually called the Hollywood visa because you had all these celebrities. Somebody like, a good example is, I think, Justin Bieber. He came to the US on an O visa. There's been a couple other Canadians. So it's extraordinary. It's also called the Hollywood type visa. So I think you've covered everything. I know. Okay. Let me jump to the TN visa. I actually have a couple clients I'm working with who on the TN visa. So the TN visa is granted to people from Mexico and or Canada. Only those two countries get the TN visa. The job has to be on what's called the NAFTA approved job list. And there's specific jobs that have to be on this list. It's not dual intent. So technically, if you're on the TN visa, you can't really apply for the green card. But this is where we say, if that's your intention, work with an immigration lawyer because they'll know how to get around this. There's no cap on this thing, apart from obviously from being from Canada or Mexico. And if you lose your job on this visa, you have to leave the country in 60 days or less. You have to find another job. And this can only be on the TN visa or H-1B visa. But in which case, then you have to look into the lottery considerations. Remember, I talked about the 85,000. Thousands of people apply for this. Another option is to switch to another non-immigrant visa. I think I covered everything. I'll pass it back to you, Manasa.
Cool. Thanks, Jane. So the next visa we're going to address is the E3 visa. E3 visa is given only to people from Australia. And I have a quick anecdote on this one. I had a couple of clients who were interestingly had migrated to Australia from India and eventually got their Australian citizenship and then had come to the US on an E3 visa, where they eventually got their green card and their US citizenship. So now they had a footprint in 3 countries. So that was always something that blew my mind. That's something about the E3 visa. It's only for people from Australia. There is a cap on that. There's only 10,500 visas on the E3 that's given out at this time. The duration is limited to 2 years, but it can be extended indefinitely, which is kind of an oxymoron, I guess, but those are the rules. And it can be extended indefinitely in 2-year increments. That's about the duration of the E3 visa. It's given to people who come here on a special occupation. They have to have a bachelor's degree or higher. And again, if they lose their job while they are on this visa, they have to leave the country in 60 days or less, or get another visa under the E3, or switch to an H-1B or some other non-immigrant visa. That's about the E3 visa. Jane?
I think we've covered them all. The one thing I do want to point out, and part of the reason why we're talking about when you lose a job on one of these visas, because by nature they're temporary. Anytime something happens with these visas, there's always the possibility that you may have to leave the country. So this is why we talk about make sure you're talking with an immigration lawyer, just in case you need to make some of these moves. These are moves I would not make on my own. So now that we've covered the visas, let's talk about the challenges these visa holders have with investing in what we're calling the special account as defined by the U.S. tax code. Manas, I'm just going to throw this right back at you. Do you want to talk about some of the challenges these folks face?
Yes. The question that I get asked most often from people who are on work visas are, should I invest in my 401k or 403b or whichever is the work retirement plan that they are on? And because these are what we call future use accounts, which means that the money is meant to be left in the accounts for a long time. You let them grow, then you take them out at a later date, depending on your situation at that time. Ideally, you're in a lower tax bracket, or if you are invested in a Roth, you don't even pay any taxes on these distributions most of the time. That's what a future use account is, typically, if you just continue to live here in the US. But if you are on a work visa, any of these work visas that we talked about, there is a chance that you may not end up staying in this country. This definitely becomes a challenge in terms of where you're going to go back to, where you're going to retire, what are the different tax treaties with the countries where you might go back to. Like I said earlier, the example of this person who came from India to Australia to the US, that's definitely a challenge because now the world is open and you don't know where you will be. That's one of them. And kind of going off of that same theme, another challenge that I have seen are the lost benefits from tax-advantaged accounts. Let me explain what I mean. If there's a country which has a tax treaty with the US, and the tax treaty recognizes that retirement account as a retirement account in the country where you will be, and you get the same tax deferred advantage as you would have if you had continued to live in the US, that's all great. But if you have moved back to a country where the tax treaty does not recognize this nature of the tax deferment of the US retirement plan, then basically you could be subject to double taxation, not only in the US where you're taking this money out, but in the country where you're now living. That's one loss of a benefit. And then also the Roth aspect of a 401k or an IRA. a lot of the countries do not recognize the Roth as a retirement plan. And therefore, you may have already paid taxes on that contribution in the US, but now you're in another country which does not recognize it. And again, double taxation. Is that worth the contribution, is what you might think about. And that could be a challenge because of all these factors. And a couple of others, quick ones, the lost benefits of tax advantaged accounts are, of course, the HSA, the 529 plan, which you'll be talking about, and other such accounts. Jane?
You've actually addressed a lot of the issues and the questions we see where people are like, should I save into a Roth account? And of course, we have to say where you're going to be, and they probably don't. But I think what you've kind of talked about is make sure you look at the treaties. So let me jump straight to college planning, which is a big deal with a lot of immigrant families coming to the US. Is when I think of a situation, I came to the US to go to college. Trust me, my kids are going to college. I get a lot of this question is, how do we save for college? And if you're a US citizen, typically we say use the 529, which is great. The money grows tax-free and the money comes out tax-free. But when you're on a temporary work visa, there are a couple of challenges you face. One, you may have to go back to your home country. After all, this is a temporary visa, right? You may have to go back to your home country before the kids attend college. And remember, if you take the money out and not use it for college, you're going to lose the tax benefits. You're going to lose the gain. So that's a big deal if you have to leave the country before your kids go to college. Another issue I find is, let's assume you're here once again and your kids were born back home, whatever back home is. So we'll define them as being foreign born, and you're not on track to get the green card, for example. It basically means your kids don't have a US Social Security number or possibly an ITIN number. Remember, you need a Social Security number or an ITIN to be a beneficiary of the account. So in a case where we think the kids are going to be able to become beneficiaries, it may make sense. But in this case, it's a challenge if you find yourself in that particular situation. And then the other one I'm going to talk about is brokerage accounts. So everybody says invest in the US, which is all good. We love the US and we love investing in the US. But the problem I find is the brokerage accounts or brokerage firms that simply refuse to open accounts for folks on work visas. You'll go to some of their websites under who can open an account. It says you have to be a US citizen or a green card holder. If you're here on any type of temporary account, including the work account, they won't open a brokerage account for you. You have situations, which is interesting, where you're working for company XYZ. They are doing their 401k, which you're probably eligible for at XYZ brokerage. You can get your 401k there, but if you go directly to XYZ custodian or brokerage firm, they will not open an account for you. And the ones that do, they make you go through hoops with the amount of paperwork they request. And we understand why. It's because of the Patriot Act and all that good stuff. But it's still a big issue. The other funny one I've found is I'll call the customer rep and the customer rep is not sure and they give you one answer. You call back tomorrow and they give you a different answer, which means you're forced to kind of call 3, 4, 5 times to figure out what you need to be doing with an account. It's probably time that we don't have, but it's just the nature of the issue. And finally, along the same lines, those brokerage accounts like the XYZ custodian I mentioned, they may let you open the account, but when you have to leave the country, remember again, this is temporarily, they make you close the account permanently. Or if they're going to let you leave the account open, they actually make it very difficult for you to make changes to the account in future. You wouldn't face this if you are a US citizen. Let's see. I think that's it for the challenges. So I'll say let's just jump straight into the solutions. One of the solutions that we think about is you need to understand your visa type. And this is going to help you in trying to figure out where to go with this account. So you want to make sure you understand the rules and regulations. So understand how long the visa is valid for, understand how you can make changes in your status. Understand the dual intentionality of your visa. We mentioned, I think, the L1 and the H1 as being dual intent, which means you can start your green card application while you're still in the country. And of course, I think you'll probably understand this when we say make sure you understand your I-94 status. When you come into the country, they stamp that to say how long you can be in the country. Make sure you look at that date and keep an eye on it, because that really determines if, for example, you lose your job, when you have to leave the country by. And then if you're going to go down the green card path, make sure you understand priority dates. So Manasa and I were talking about before we started recording that if you're from India, and we both looked at I think it was the April, maybe 2023 visa bulletin, the current priority date for EB2 is January 2011. China, I think, was June 8th, 2019, which basically means it's going to be a very long time before you get that green card. So you want to make sure you understand that. And as you make your investing decisions, you're keeping that in mind. Like, when am I able to get the green card if I will? One of the things we always talk about is absolutely have a few immigration lawyers in your corner and not your company lawyers. And I think you understand why we're saying this. So let's see. I think I've covered the main stuff. So Manas, how about I pass it back to you to talk about the 401ks and the tax treaties and all that stuff as part of a possible solution?
Yes. Thank you, Jane. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying about the rules and regulations and the dual intentionality and the green card priority dates. Those are all things we definitely need to keep in mind when making financial and tax planning decisions, which brings us to what we were talking about earlier with the employer retirement plans, the 401ks, 403bs, 457s, etc. When you are most likely not to continue to stay in the US later when your visa expires, etc., what do you do with the 401k? And Jane and I have talked about this a lot. And we feel that the best solution really in these cases is to get that employer match. Remember, we've talked about these on other episodes as well. That is basically free money. The employer is giving it to you for just having a 401k account and contributing into it. So get the match. If you're able to afford it, maximize your 401k, whatever the amount is for the year. And also get that tax break, because you may now be in a 32% or a 28%. Who knows? You may be in the highest 37% tax bracket. And this may be the only avenue you have to get that tax break. So get that tax break. And also look at leaving the money in your 401k after factoring in everything that Jane said earlier about the different brokerages and whether they allow you to keep your account from overseas, etc. But consider leaving the money in your 401k till you turn 59 and a half. And depending on how old you are at this time, that may be quite a long time away or not, but it does give the opportunity for that nest egg to grow, at least till you're in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it's very important to look at these Roth types. You know, the Roth IRA, the Roth 401k, the Roth 403b, because everybody talks about Roth. Like, it's the most popular, the next best thing to sliced bread, like they say in the US. Oh, that's the Roth. Are you doing the Roth? But are you a person on a non-immigrant visa? Then work with a professional. We keep saying this ad nauseum. Work with a professional. Find out if a Roth is a good opportunity for you. Should you go back to the country you're from again, like we were talking about earlier? What does a tax treaty say? Will that country where you're planning to go back recognize the Roth as a a retirement plan and let you take the same tax deferred status. And also there are nuances. Of you may have saved money in the US and now you're taking that money out after you turn 59 and a half. Maybe you're not paying taxes, but you are in the country where you live. And this is why working with another professional who can look at all these nuances, it's a great solution, especially when dealing with numbers in your 401k and 403b, which, don't get me wrong, I totally understand. This is all hard-earned money that you've put away, hoping for it to grow and become a nest egg. So I'll pass it back to you, Jane. What do you say?
I think you've said enough about that. So I'm just going to jump straight to one of my favorite accounts, the 529. In terms of solution, when people reach out to me and say, oh, what do we do with this? Again, this is just for educational purposes. It's not specific investment advice. But one way to think about it is if you're going to be in the US somehow, your kids were born in the US, you know they're going to go to school in the US, okay, then it makes sense to do the 529. The other thing to consider is there are very few schools which are on what we call the foreign approved list. So they're foreign schools, colleges where you can use the 529. So your kids just been born in the US. Remember, they have to be beneficiaries in the US. And you know you're from XYZ, they're going to be going to Z country and there's a college or university there and it allows a 529. Okay, then it kind of probably makes sense to go ahead and do it. For example, Manasa and I were talking about a client who the kids were born in the US. He's from India. He's a citizen. He's moved back to India. And right now the son is attending an approved UK university, which allows the 529 to be used. So, and of course, like I said, because the kid was born in the US, it obviously means they already have a social security. So very narrow case use of where you can use this. If, again, your kids don't have a social security or ITIN number, it's probably just best to kind of skip. I hate to say this, some of these accounts, despite the tax benefit advantage that you get from them. In terms of a bigger solution, even for the college savings, your best bet really is to make sure you have a brokerage account. This is the one account we recommend to everybody that reaches out to us. Where you open it is a different case, but really have a brokerage account, because remember, if you leave the money there for more than a year, you only tax on the capital gains at something like 15%, depending on your income bracket. Use a brokerage account. The two brokerages that we have experience and we know will open accounts for folks on work visas, one is Charles Schwab and Interactive Brokers. Those are the two that seem to be friendly to folks who are on work visas, basically people who are here on a temporary basis. The other thing we talk about with some of this, if you end up having to leave, at some point you may leave the country if you don't get your green card, is consider having a U.S. address if you're moving outside the U.S. But also understand whatever the brokerage firm, they may end up putting restrictions on your account. Just be prepared for that. In terms of solutions, I think the thing I talk about, or we talk a lot about, is stay flexible as possible, which means you could come to me, we'll talk about a certain solution, and next year we end up changing it. So please stay flexible. And then you really need to stay up to date with changes in immigration, especially as far as your type of visa is concerned. So make sure you know what's happening, especially with the political climate. We know there's going to be changes in the next 1-2 years. So please make sure you understand what's happening. If they make changes to what happens with your visa type, please make sure you stay up to date with those changes. Can you think of anything else, Manasa, to add to this?
No, these were great. All of them were absolutely fantastic. One quick thing that I do want to point out is a 529 plan tax benefit is usually restricted to state taxation. So that's something to consider. But of course, that brings us to the end of this great episode. What I would like to say in conclusion is, yes, stay up to date with all tax law changes as it applies to foreign nationals. And yeah, so dear listener, I hope you found this episode to be as useful as we were hoping that it would be. And if you like this and like our content, please share, please subscribe on your favorite platform, and let all your friends and family know. Please like us on social media. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the International Money Cafe podcast. The content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for professional advice. Seek the advice of your qualified service provider with any questions you may have regarding your cross-border finances and tax needs.